In the spring of 1983, in the clay hills of Oak Haven County, Arthur Vance bought the tangle. He paid the county tax assessor $90 an acre for 40 acres of land that everyone agreed was worthless. The parcel was a jagged rectangle on the county map, wedged between his own productive southern fields and the state forest to the north. It had no road frontage. Its only access was a forgotten logging trace that snaked off the back of Arthur's property. For 50 years, it had been called the Tangle. Before that, it was the Miller Place, but the Millers had given up on it during the Depression, and the land had gone feral. It was a solid, unassailable wall of vegetation. Multiflora rose, brought in decades ago for living fences, had consumed it. The canes grew 20 feet long, arching over and rooting where they touched, creating impenetrable thickets. Japanese honeysuckle climbed over the roses, its vines as thick as a man's wrist, choking out everything else. Poison ivy, with hairy, menacing ropes, climbed every struggling tree. Underneath it all, a dense mat of roots, rhizomes, and forgotten stones held the poor soil in a permanent, unproductive grip. Arthur Vance was 71 years old that spring. He was a quiet man, with hands that were thick and calloused into the shape of the tools he used. He had farmed the same 160 acres his father had farmed, and his grandfather before him. He was debt-free. His equipment was old but meticulously maintained. He owned a 1952 John Deere Model B for light work and a 1968 John Deere 4020 for the heavy pulling. He did not own a computer, and his account books were kept in a leather-bound ledger with a pencil. The men at the Oak Haven Feed and Seed talked about his purchase. They sat on upturned buckets and stacked feed sacks, drinking coffee from chipped ceramic mugs. Howard Fink, who had sold his farm to a developer and now sold crop insurance, shook his head. He said Arthur had finally lost his mind. He said you could pour $10,000 of chemical on that land and it would just laugh at you. He said you could take 2 D9 bulldozers to it and they would bog down in the muck and thorn. Frank Miller, whose great-uncle had been the one to abandon the property, spat a stream of tobacco juice into a tin can. He remembered his father telling stories about that piece of ground. He said it was mean land. It grew rocks faster than it grew corn, and it grew thorn bushes faster than it grew rocks. He said Arthur Vance had bought himself a 40-acre problem with no solution. The others nodded in agreement. They saw it as the final, sad act of a man out of step with the times, a man clinging to a past that no longer made sense. They pitied him. The problem of the Tangle was not a new one. In the 1960s, a timber company had bought it with the intention of clearing it for pine plantation. They brought in a bulldozer, a Caterpillar D6, and tried to scrape the brush into piles for burning. The dozer cleared 3 acres in a week, compacting the wet clay soil into a brick-like substance. Then a summer thunderstorm rolled through, and the machine sank to its belly in the mire it had created. It took them another week and a second machine to pull it out. The company wrote the project off as a loss and sold the land back to the county. In the late 1970s, a young, ambitious farmer with a degree from the State Agricultural College tried a different approach. He leased the land for $1 a year. He was a proponent of modern chemical farming. He flew a crop duster over the Tangle and sprayed it with a heavy dose of 2,4-D and glyphosate. The leaves yellowed and dropped, and for a few months, the land looked dead. But the chemicals never reached the massive, woody root crowns of the multiflora rose. The following spring, the brush came back with a vengeance, thicker and more aggressive than before. The young farmer did not renew his lease. The land became a local legend, a piece of geography that was simply accepted as a permanent failure. It was a place where things went to be lost. Deer hunters who tracked a buck into its edges would give up, unwilling to risk the thorns and the poison ivy. It was a monument to the stubbornness of nature over the ambitions of man. And now, Arthur Vance, a man with more yesterdays than tomorrows, had made it his own. 2 weeks after the purchase, a clean white pickup truck with the county seal on the door pulled into Arthur's driveway. A man in his late 30s stepped out. He wore pressed khaki pants, a polo shirt with a university logo, and clean work boots. He carried a stainless steel soil auger and a clipboard. This was Mr. Redding, the new county extension agent. Redding had a degree in agronomy and a belief in data. He saw farming as a series of inputs and outputs that could be optimized for maximum efficiency. He had heard about Arthur's purchase at the feed store and had come to offer his professional, educated opinion. He considered it his duty to save the old farmer from his own folly. Arthur met him on the porch. He did not offer a seat. He simply stood, waiting. "Mr. Vance," Redding began, with a practiced, friendly smile. "I'm Dale Redding, from the County Extension Office. I heard you picked up the old Miller place. I was in the area, thought I'd stop by and see if I could be of any help." Arthur nodded once. "Arthur. Right, Arthur. Look, I've seen the file on that parcel. It's a tough one. I brought my auger. I'd like to take a few soil samples, if you don't mind. We can get them tested, see what you're really up against in terms of pH and nutrient deficiencies. My guess is it's highly acidic and leached of just about everything." Arthur looked at the shiny auger, then at Redding's clean hands. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. "Go ahead." He led Redding not to the tangle itself, but to the edge of his own southern field, where the neat rows of last year's corn stubble met the chaotic wall of the thicket. The contrast was stark. On one side was order, productivity, and life managed by a human hand. On the other was a riot of thorns and vines, a place that seemed to actively resist human intention. Redding walked to the edge of the tangle and stopped. He stared into it, his confident expression faltering for a moment. The sheer density of the growth was something the aerial photographs in his office had not conveyed. It was not just brush, it was a fortress. "Wow," he said, shaking his head. "She's really something, isn't she?" He found a spot a few feet from the edge, where a patch of bare ground was visible. He twisted the auger into the soil. It went down 6 inches and then stopped with a grating sound. He tried again a few feet away. The same result. He was hitting shale and compacted clay. He finally managed to get a core sample of about 8 inches. The soil was pale, full of clay, and laced with a web of fine roots. He bagged the sample and labeled it carefully. He took 2 more samples with similar difficulty. He made notes on his clipboard, a series of numbers and codes. He scribbled calculations in the margins. After 20 minutes, he straightened up and turned to Arthur, who had been watching him without a word, his arms crossed over his chest. "Well, Arthur," Redding said, adopting the tone of a doctor delivering bad news. "It's about what I expected, only worse. The soil compaction is off the charts. The previous attempts with heavy machinery probably did that. The topsoil is thin, maybe 4 inches, and what's there is likely very acidic from all the leaf litter decay. The nutrient lockup must be severe." He flipped a page on his clipboard. "I ran some preliminary numbers. To clear this mechanically, you're looking at a cost of at least $600 an acre, and that's if you can find an operator willing to risk his machine. Then you'd need to stump it, root rake it, and deep rip it to break up the hardpan. After that, you'd need several tons of lime per acre to correct the pH. Then you'd need to pour on the nitrogen and phosphorus just to get a cover crop to grow." He paused, letting the weight of the figures sink in. "Realistically, you're looking at an investment of over $1,000 an acre before you could even think about planting a cash crop. And with corn prices what they are, you'd never see a return on that investment. Not in your lifetime." Redding's voice was full of a gentle, professional pity. "My official recommendation, Arthur, would be to enroll it in a forestry reclamation program. Plant some pines. In 30 years, your grandkids might have something to harvest. But as for farming it, it's just not economically viable." "I'm sorry." Arthur Vance looked past Redding, his gaze fixed on the wall of green. He seemed to be looking at something Redding couldn't see. After a long silence, he spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. "It's good soil," he said. Redding blinked. He looked at the pale, clumpy dirt in his sample bag, then back at Arthur. He thought the old man was in denial. "Arthur, with all due respect, the data doesn't support that. This is marginal land at best. The soil is good, Arthur repeated, not as an argument, but as a statement of fact. It's just sleeping. Redding gave a tight, condescending smile. He made a final note on his clipboard. All right then. Well, my office is always here if you change your mind. We can help with the paperwork for the forestry program. You have a good day. He walked back to his clean truck, placed the auger and clipboard carefully in the passenger seat, and drove away, shaking his head. The story he would tell back at the office was one of an old man's stubborn pride, a classic case of sentiment triumphing over sense. He felt sorry for him, but he had done his duty. He had presented the facts. The math was clear. The land was a lost cause. The men at the feed store heard about Redding's visit. Howard Fink said it proved his point. If the county extension agent, a man with a college degree, said it was impossible, then it was impossible. Frank Miller said Arthur was always a stubborn man, but this was different. This was foolishness. The consensus in Oak Haven County was settled. Arthur Vance had thrown his money away on a 40-acre bed of thorns. Arthur did not go to the feed store that week. He did not seem to notice the pitying glances from neighbors he passed on the road. He was not thinking about Mr. Redding's data or the community's opinion. He was thinking about a conversation he had with his father 45 years earlier. He was a young man then, just back from the war in Europe. He was full of new ideas, some of them learned from books, some of them from the vast, efficient farms he had seen in other places. He had looked at the tangle, which was bad then but not as bad as it was now, and had seen a problem to be solved with force and machinery. He had stood with his father, Thomas Vance, on the same spot where he had stood with Redding. Thomas was a man much like Arthur would become, quiet, observant, with a deep and unsentimental understanding of the land he worked. We could clear that, young Arthur had said, full of youthful confidence. Bring in a dozer. Push it all into a pile and burn it. Plow it deep. It would be good pasture in 2 years. His father had not answered immediately. He had taken out his pocket knife, a well-worn case trapper, and scraped a bit of mud from his boot. He looked at the wall of brush, his eyes narrowed in concentration, as if he were reading a book written in a difficult language. You look at that land, and you see an enemy, Thomas said finally. You see something to be fought. To be scraped clean. That's the mistake everyone makes. It's a waste, Arthur had insisted. 40 acres of nothing. It's not nothing, his father corrected him gently. It's full of life. Just not the life we want. You can't beat it by scraping it. The land doesn't want to be scraped. It puts on a scab, like skin does. You scrape off the scab, it just makes a tougher 1 inch. He pointed with the tip of his knife toward the thicket. All that growth, that's energy. A whole lot of it. You bring in a bulldozer, you spend your own energy, your own money, fighting it. You burn it, you send all that energy up into the sky as smoke. And you're left with compacted, wounded ground. The land resents it. It fights back harder. Arthur had been skeptical. This sounded like folklore, not farming. So we just let it sit there. No, his father said. He closed his knife with a soft click and put it back in his pocket. He then delivered the principle that Arthur had carried with him for nearly half a century. You don't fight the tangle, son. You make it eat itself. He had then led Arthur to a small holding pen behind the barn. It was a half-acre of overgrown woods and brush, not as dense as the tangle, but wild enough. In the pen were 2 old Berkshire sows. They were not there to be fattened for market. They were there for a different purpose. The ground in the pen was churned and tilled as if by a rotary plow. The sows were rooting, their powerful snouts digging into the earth, flipping over clumps of sod to get at the roots and grubs beneath. They had cleared patches of ground down to the bare soil. They had eaten the leaves off the low-hanging branches. They had stripped the bark from the saplings. A pig, Thomas Vance had explained, is the best land-clearing machine ever made. It doesn't compact the soil, it aerates it. It doesn't scrape off the nutrients, it adds its own. It doesn't just eat the leaves, it eats the roots. A pig is patient. It works all day, every day. It turns thorns and weeds and poison ivy into bacon. It turns a problem into a solution. He had explained the principle. The land doesn't want to be scraped clean. It wants to be worked. You use an animal that is designed to work the land. An animal that sees a dense thicket not as an obstacle, but as a buffet. This was the knowledge Arthur Vance possessed. It was not stored on a clipboard or in a university database. It was stored in his memory, a lesson learned from his father, who had learned it from his. It was knowledge specific to this place, to this soil, to these plants. It was a deeper kind of data, collected over generations of observation. Arthur had a notebook. It was a simple, black, hardcover ledger, the kind used for accounting. In it, his father had kept records. Not just of planting dates and yields, but of observations. There were entries about the weather, about the behavior of wildlife, about which weeds grew in which years. On a page dated 1938, his father had written, "Put the 2 gilts in the back lot. They cleared the sumac in a month. Seemed to favor the roots. Ground is soft now. Ready for seeding." Another entry from 1946, tried clearing the creek bank with the tractor and chain. Made a mess. Brought in 3 hogs. They had it clean in 2 months and didn't cause any erosion. They eat the poison ivy first. This notebook was the physical manifestation of his knowledge. It was not a manual of procedures, but a record of a dialogue between his family and their land. It was filled with simple, powerful truths. The rock is not the enemy, it holds the water. The water doesn't disappear, it just goes somewhere else. And the one that mattered now, the pig is the plow. Armed with this knowledge, Arthur began his work. He did not seek approval. He did not announce his plans. He acted. His first task was the fence. The tangle needed to be contained. He needed a fence that was strong, durable, and pig-proof. He would not use modern steel T-posts and electric wire. He would build a fence the way his father had taught him, a fence meant to last for 50 years. He went into his own woodlot, the one his grandfather had planted with black locust trees. The black locust is a hard, dense wood, naturally resistant to rot. A locust post, properly set, will outlast the man who set it. He used his old McCulloch chainsaw, a Pro Max 610 from 1978, to fell 10-inch diameter trees. He cut them into 8-foot lengths. He loaded them onto his utility trailer with a cant hook and hauled them to his workshop. There, he used a draw knife to peel the bark from the posts. It was slow, satisfying work. The blade curled the bark away, revealing the pale, yellow-green wood beneath. He sharpened one end of each post to a point with a framing axe. He did this for 200 posts. It took him a week. The men at the feed store would have called it a waste of time. You could buy treated pine posts for a few dollars each. But Arthur knew that treated pine posts rotted at the ground line in 10 years. Locust posts did not. Next, he began to clear the fence line. He could not drive his tractor into the tangle, so he worked by hand. He used a set of long-handled loppers and a Swedish brush axe. He cut a path 4 feet wide around the entire perimeter of the 40 acres. It was brutal, punishing work. The multiflora rose thorns tore at his canvas jacket and his leather gloves. He moved slowly, methodically. He cut a section, cleared the brush, and then moved on. He worked from sunup until his back ached, and then he worked for another hour. He was not just clearing a path. He was learning the land. He found the low spots where water collected. He found the ridges where the soil was thin and rocky. He found an old stone wall, tumbled down and buried in vines, that marked the original boundary of the Miller farm. He was re-establishing a relationship with a piece of ground that had been ignored for half a century. Once the line was cleared, he set the posts. He used a manual post hole digger, a heavy clamshell-style tool that had belonged to his father. He dug each hole 3 feet deep. He set the post, checked it for plumb with a small spirit level, and backfilled the hole, tamping the earth down with a heavy iron bar until the post was as solid as if it had grown there. He set the posts 10 feet apart. The math was simple. A 40-acre square has a perimeter of roughly 3,520 feet. He needed 352 posts. He went back to the woodlot and cut more. The work took him the entire month of April. Redding drove by once on the county road a half-mile away. He saw the distant figure of an old man working alone on the edge of the tangle and shook his head with a mixture of pity and professional frustration. He saw a man engaged in a futile, back-breaking gesture. He did not see a man laying the foundation for a profound transformation. When the posts were set, Arthur bought the wire. He drove his 1972 Ford F-100 pickup to the farm supply store in the next county, bypassing the Oak Haven feed and seed. He bought 20 rolls of 39-inch woven wire fencing, with small holes at the bottom and larger ones at the top. It was designed for hogs. He also bought a come-along fence stretcher and a bucket of heavy-gauge staples. He and his grandson, Ben, spent the next 2 weeks stretching the wire. Ben was 16, quiet and observant like his grandfather. He didn't ask why they were fencing the tangle. He just watched and learned. He learned how to properly brace a corner post so it could withstand 1,000 pounds of tension. He learned how to splice a roll of wire so it was as strong as an unbroken section. He learned the rhythm of the work, stretch the wire until it hummed with tension, then drive the staples in deep, 2 for each post. When they were finished, the tangle was surrounded by a perfect, taut fence. It was a serious, agricultural fence, a statement of intent. It looked incongruous, a piece of order imposed on a landscape of chaos. Now, he needed the tools for the job itself. He drove to a livestock auction 3 counties away. He was not looking for prime breeding stock or show animals. He was looking for hardy, aggressive foragers. He bought 30 pigs. They were a motley crew, a mix of breeds. Some looked to have Tamworth in them, with their long snouts built for rooting. Others were spotted, with the heavy build of Gloucester Old Spots. They were young, about 50 pounds each, and hungry. They cost him $35 apiece. He hauled them home in his stock trailer. Before letting them into the tangle, he set up a simple water system. He ran a black plastic pipe from the well behind his barn, powered by an old, reliable Lister single-cylinder diesel engine. The engine chugged along with a slow, reassuring rhythm, thump thump thump. It pumped water to a large, galvanized steel stock tank just inside the fence line. He built a simple A-frame shelter out of scrap lumber and tin roofing, a place for the pigs to get out of the summer sun and the winter wind. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early May, he opened the gate. The 30 pigs hesitated for a moment, blinking in the bright sunlight. Then they smelled the damp earth and the green, growing things. They poured through the gate and disappeared into the wall of brush. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of their movement, the rustling and crashing of their bodies forcing a path through the undergrowth. Then, a new sound began, the sound of contented grunting and the vigorous tearing of vegetation. The work had begun. Arthur did not just leave them there. He observed them. Every morning and every evening, he walked the perimeter of the fence. He carried a pair of old Bushnell binoculars. He watched the pigs' behavior. In the first week, they did not venture far from the gate. They cleared a small area around the water trough and the shelter, eating the most palatable plants first. He noticed, as his father's notebook had predicted, that they went for the poison ivy immediately. They seemed to relish it, tearing the hairy vines from the trees and eating them, leaves, stems, and all. They were immune to the urushiol oil that caused such misery in humans. Within 2 weeks, they had cleared all the poison ivy within a 50-foot radius of the gate. The men at the feed store heard about the pigs. The story was now a full-blown joke. Arthur Vance wasn't just the man who bought the tangle, he was the man who was trying to clear it with a handful of pigs. Howard Fink laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. He said you'd need 1,000 pigs, and even then, they'd probably just get lost and eaten by coyotes. The consensus was that Arthur's folly had entered a new, more comical phase. By the end of the first month, the pigs had established a network of trails through the densest parts of the brush near the gate. They had created a staging area, an acre of land that was now mostly bare earth. They had eaten everything green they could reach. Now, they began the real work. They began to root. A pig's snout is a remarkable tool. It is a combination of a plough, a spade, and a delicate sensory organ. They began to dig. They were searching for roots, tubers, grubs, and earthworms. They started with the shallow-rooted weeds, but soon they turned their attention to the true enemy, the multiflora rose. The rose bushes were supported by massive, woody root crowns, some of them 2 feet in diameter. The pigs would work together. One would start digging at the edge of a crown, using its snout to pry and lift. Others would join in, tearing at the exposed roots with their teeth. They worked with a relentless, single-minded focus. The sound of roots snapping and tearing carried across the fields. Arthur watched this process with quiet satisfaction. A bulldozer would have scraped the topsoil away to get at the roots. A chemical would have killed the leaves but left the crown intact, ready to sprout again. The pigs were performing a kind of surgery. They were dismantling the problem from below, at its source. And as they worked, they tilled the soil. They broke up the compacted clay. Their hooves churned the ground. Their manure, rich in nitrogen, was worked directly into the earth. They were not just clearing the land, they were cultivating it. They were rebuilding the soil structure that the D6 dozer had destroyed years ago. Through June and July, the process accelerated. The pigs, now growing rapidly, pushed deeper into the tangle. The cleared area expanded from 1 acre to 5, then to 10. From a distance, it looked like a slow-moving wave of destruction. But up close, it was a process of transformation. The pale, dead clay that Redding had sampled was being turned into a dark, crumbly loam. Earthworms, absent from the compacted soil, began to reappear. Arthur managed the process. He noticed the pigs were concentrating their efforts in one area. To encourage them to move to a new section, he moved their water trough. He dragged the heavy steel tank 100 yards to the north, to a section still thick with brush. The pigs followed the water. Within a day, they had begun their work in the new location. He was not their master, he was their partner, guiding their natural instincts toward his desired outcome. He supplemented their diet. Foraging alone would not be enough to sustain their rapid growth. Every evening, he would drive his old John Deere B, pulling a small wagon, to the edge of the tangle. He would fill a series of troughs with a mix of shelled corn and soybean meal. This was not a full ration. It was just enough to keep them healthy and to keep them coming back to a central point. It also taught them to associate him with food, which would make them easier to handle later. The summer was hot and dry. The corn in Arthur's main fields began to show signs of stress, the leaves curling in the afternoon sun. But in the tangle, the pigs continued their work. They wallowed in the low spots, creating muddy pits that held the infrequent rain. Their constant tilling action created a layer of loose soil on the surface, dust mulch that helped to conserve the moisture below. While other farmers were worrying about their crops, Arthur was watching his land being reborn. By September, the change was dramatic. Nearly half of the tangle, the 20 acres on the southern side, was cleared of underbrush. What remained were the larger trees, oaks, hickories, and a few wild cherries, and the stubborn skeletons of the largest multiflora rose bushes. The ground beneath them was a sea of churned earth, dotted with the occasional rock that the pigs had unearthed. The pigs themselves were now large, approaching 200 pounds. They were sleek and muscular, not fat like pigs raised in confinement. They were athletes, conditioned by months of hard work and a varied diet. Skeptics still drove by on the county road, but their laughter was less confident now. What they were seeing no longer looked like a joke. It looked like progress. They couldn't understand how it was happening. They saw the pigs, but they couldn't grasp the underlying principle. They saw it as a strange anomaly, not a deliberate, replicable process. Frank Miller, at the feed store, admitted that it looked like Arthur had done something out there, but he predicted that the brush would grow back as soon as the pigs were gone. He was still focused on the surface, on the removal of the vegetation. He did not understand that the real work was happening in the soil itself. One afternoon in late September, Dale Redding drove by. He was on his way back from a farm visit where he had been advising a farmer on the proper application rates for a new, expensive herbicide. He glanced over at the Vance place out of habit, expecting to see the same wall of green he had seen in the spring. He slowed his truck. He stopped. He got out and stood by the side of the road, staring. The change was so profound that for a moment he thought he was mistaken, that he had misremembered where the tangle began. The impenetrable wall was gone. In its place was a rolling landscape of freshly turned earth, dotted with mature trees. It looked like a park, or a field that had been recently plowed. He could see all the way to the state forest on the far side. He saw the pigs, moving through the trees, their dark bodies stark against the brown earth. This was the first undeniable sign of success. It was a visual fact that could not be refuted by spreadsheets or soil sample data. Redding was a man who believed in what he could measure, and what he was looking at was a measurement of success on a scale he had declared impossible. He stood there for a long time, silent and contemplative. He was re-evaluating. He replayed his conversation with Arthur in his mind. It's good soil. It's just sleeping. He had dismissed the words as the ramblings of a stubborn old man. Now, he was forced to consider that they might have been the simple, literal truth. He thought about the report he had filed. Parcel 7B, economically unviable for agricultural use. Recommendation, reforestation or abandonment. He had built his assessment on a set of assumptions. He had assumed that land clearing required heavy machinery or powerful chemicals. He had assumed that the only way to add fertility was from a bag. He had looked at the tangle and seen only problems. He had failed to see the energy, the life that Arthur's father had spoken of. His professional worldview was shaken. He had been trained to provide solutions, but here was a problem that had been solved in a way that his training had never conceived of. It was a solution that was elegant, low cost, and regenerative. It had not wounded the land, it had healed it. In October, Arthur decided the pigs had done enough work for the year. The southern half of the tangle was cleared. The northern half could wait for another season. It was time to harvest the fruits of their labor. With Ben's help, he set up a simple corral and loading chute near the gate. He used the daily feeding ritual to lure the pigs into the corral. It took 3 days of patient work, but he eventually had all 30 of them contained. He sorted them, keeping 5 of the best young sows, the gilts, to be the foundation of his own small herd. The other 25 he loaded into his stock trailer. He took them to the same livestock auction where he had bought them. They were now prime market hogs, averaging 240 pounds. The price of pork was high that fall. They sold for 70 cents a pound. The success could now be quantified. Arthur sat at his kitchen table with his ledger and a pencil. The math did not require a calculator. Initial cost of 30 pigs at $35 each, $1,050. Cost of supplemental feed for 6 months, $1,500. Cost of fencing materials, $800. Total cash outlay, $3,350. Sale of 25 hogs, 240 pounds average at $0.70, $4,200. He had cleared 20 acres of the most difficult land in the county. He had turned a profit of $850. And he still had 5 gilts, worth another $500, and a permanent, 50-year fence. He had converted a worthless piece of ground into a potential asset. He compared this to Redding's estimate. To clear the same 20 acres with machinery and chemicals would have cost, by Redding's own conservative figures, over $20,000. And the result would have been compacted, sterile soil requiring thousands more in inputs to become productive. Arthur had achieved a superior result not just for less money, but at a profit. He had done it by partnering with the natural systems of the land, not by declaring war on them. The final result was the land itself. The work was not yet complete, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The tangle was no longer a tangle. It was a field in the making. The success was absolute and undeniable, written into the landscape itself. A week later, Redding's white county truck pulled into Arthur's driveway again. This time, Redding did not get out immediately. He sat in his truck for a few minutes, as if gathering his thoughts. When he did emerge, he was not carrying a clipboard. His hands were empty. Arthur was on his porch, oiling a piece of harness leather. He watched Redding approach but did not get up. Redding stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked tired. The confident, professional smile was gone. He looked up at Arthur, and for a moment, he seemed unsure of what to say. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice quiet. "Arthur. I drove by last week. I saw what you've done." Arthur nodded, continuing to work the oil into the leather with a soft cloth. Redding took a deep breath. "I came here today to say two things. First, I was wrong. Completely and utterly wrong. What I said back in the spring, my whole assessment, it was worthless. I apologize. It was a direct, unambiguous admission of error. It was an act of intellectual humility that was rare in a man of his position." Arthur stopped his work. He looked at Redding. He saw not a fool, but a man who was willing to learn. He gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. "The second thing," Redding continued, "is a question. How? How did you do it? I saw the pigs, but I don't understand the process. My training, my books, they have nothing in them that explains this. I need to understand." This was the moment of reconciliation, the closing of the gap between institutional knowledge and generational wisdom. Arthur was not a man given to gloating. He did not see this as a victory over Redding, but as an opportunity to pass on a piece of truth. He set down the harness and the cloth. "It's not my idea," he said. "It was my father's." He then explained the principle, using the same simple, direct language his father had used with him 45 years ago. "You looked at that land and saw a problem to be solved with force," Arthur said. "My father taught me to see it as a system that was out of balance. All that brush is stored energy. The pigs don't destroy that energy. They convert it." He explained the details. "They eat the poison ivy first. They like it. Then they eat the leaves and soft stems of the other plants. But the real work is the rooting. A pig is designed to dig. They are not just looking for food, they are breaking up the compacted soil. They are tilling the ground more deeply and gently than a machine can. They are aerating it." He leaned forward slightly. "They don't just clear the land. They work it. Their manure isn't a waste product, it's the first application of fertilizer, and they plow it in themselves. They find the rocks and push them to the surface. They turn a dead, hard soil into a living one. They make the land ready." He spoke for 10 minutes, the longest speech Redding had ever heard him give. He explained how he moved the water to manage their efforts, how the supplemental feed was just enough to keep the process efficient. He explained that the goal was not just to remove the brush, but to restore the health of the soil beneath it. "You make it eat itself," Arthur concluded, quoting his father directly. "The pigs eat the brush, the soil eats the waste, and the whole system starts working again." Redding listened, his expression intent. He was not taking notes, but he was absorbing every word. He was connecting the abstract principle to the physical result he had witnessed. He finally understood. It was not a trick. It was a profound ecological insight. "Thank you," Redding said, his voice full of genuine respect. "Thank you for explaining that. You've given me a lot to think about." He left a different man than the one who had arrived. The experience had fundamentally altered his understanding of his profession. He saw the limitations of a purely data-driven approach. He saw the value in the quiet, accumulated wisdom of men like Arthur Vance. 2 months later, the county extension office released a new bulletin. It was titled, "Integrated Brush Management Using Livestock Systems." It described, in dry, technical language, the process of using hogs to clear overgrown land. It detailed the benefits: low cost, soil aeration, natural fertilization, and reduced erosion. It did not mention Arthur Vance by name, but it cited a recent successful 40-acre reclamation project in the eastern part of the county as its primary case study. The knowledge had been adopted. It had been translated from the language of generational wisdom into the language of institutional procedure. The ripple effect had begun. A handful of other farmers, facing similar problems with overgrown pasture, read the bulletin and decided to try the method. The joke about Vance's pig pasture had become a respected agricultural technique. Over the winter, Arthur let the cleared land rest. The frost worked on the churned soil, breaking down the clods. The 5 gilts he had kept foraged on the remaining roots and acorns. In the spring, he brought in a boar and bred them. That spring, he and Ben walked the cleared field. The earth was dark and rich. It smelled alive. Arthur did not plough it. The pigs had already done that. He simply used his old John Deere bee and a disc harrow to lightly work the surface, preparing a seed bed. He planted buckwheat. It was not a cash crop. It was a cover crop, meant to further improve the soil. It grew quickly, its white flowers attracting bees from all over the county. When it was mature, he didn't harvest it. He disked it back into the soil, green manure that added organic matter and nutrients. The new normal began to set in. The cleared 20 acres were no longer a remarkable sight. They were just another field, part of the working landscape of the farm. The story of the pigs became local law, a tale told at the feed store not with ridicule, but with a grudging respect. Arthur Vance was no longer the foolish old man, he was the man who had tamed the tangle. That summer, he put the 5 sows and their new litters of piglets, 40 in all, into the remaining 20 acres on the northern side of the tangle. The process began again. One afternoon, as Arthur was checking the fence, he saw Ben standing at the edge of the newly cleared field, the one now green with buckwheat. Ben was crumbling the soil in his hand, letting it run through his fingers. He was looking at it with the same quiet concentration Arthur had seen in his own father. Arthur walked over to him. "What do you see?" he asked. Ben looked up. "It feels different," he said. "The soil in the other fields is good, but this feels alive." Arthur knew then that the boy understood. He had not just seen the work, he had understood the principle behind it. The knowledge was secure. Arthur went back to the farmhouse. He came back with the old, black, hardcover ledger, his father's notebook. He held it out to Ben. "Your great-grandfather started this," Arthur said. "My father added to it. I've put a few things in it myself. It's your turn now." Ben took the book. He held it carefully, as if it were a precious thing. He opened it and saw the neat, old-fashioned handwriting, the records of seasons and observations stretching back nearly a century. This was not a textbook. It was a family history, written in the language of the land. The torch had been passed. The next year, Arthur planted corn in the first field that had been cleared. The stalks grew thick and tall, their leaves a deep, healthy green. He used a fraction of the fertilizer he used on his other fields. When he harvested it that fall, the yield was 180 bushels to the acre, 30 bushels higher than the county average. The land was not just productive, it was abundant. He stood with Ben at the edge of the field, looking at the bounty. The old locust fence posts he had set by hand stood like silent sentinels, their wood weathered to a silver gray. They were the enduring symbol of the project, a testament to the value of doing a thing right, with patience and with materials that last. They would stand long after he was gone, a quiet reminder of the man who built them. Some things don't become obsolete. They are not erased by new technologies or new theories. They just wait. They wait for people to remember why they worked in the first place, to rediscover the simple, powerful truths that are written not in books, but in the soil itself.